The morning sun beat down on the dusty town square of Cedar Falls, but Eliza May Hartwell felt nothing but cold shame as she stood on the wooden auction platform. Her hands trembled as she tried to keep her chin up while the auctioneer's voice boomed across the crowd like she was nothing more than livestock. "What am I bid for 5 years of this woman's service?" he shouted, tapping his wooden gavel against the podium. "She cooks, she cleans, she'll work till her fingers bleed. Strong back, good teeth, no children to slow her down." Men in the crowd stepped closer, examining her like they would a horse at market. One grabbed her hand to check for calluses. Another made her open her mouth to inspect her teeth. Eliza wanted to disappear in the ground, but she forced herself to stand tall. She'd lost everything: her parents, her teaching job, even the man she thought would marry her. But she wouldn't lose her dignity. Not today. "Look at those hands," called out Samuel Briggs, a cruel-faced merchant who owned the dry goods store. His eyes were cold as winter stone, soft as a baby's. "This one's been living easy. She'll need some breaking in." The men around him laughed, and Eliza's stomach turned. She'd heard stories about Briggs. Women who worked for him didn't last long, and those who did came back to town with fear in their eyes. The auctioneer nodded enthusiastically. "That's right, gentlemen. She's been a school teacher, so she's got education. Can read and write. Do your books, teach your children. What more could you want in 5 years of service?" He gestured toward her like she was a prize bull. "Starting bid is $25. 30, shouted a farmer from the back. 40, called another. Eliza closed her eyes, trying to block out the sound of her life being bargained away. This was what happened to women like her. Women with no family, no money, no protection. When her fiancé, Thomas, ran off with her inheritance 6 months ago, she'd been left with nothing but debts. The bank took her little house. The school board said they couldn't keep an unmarried woman with no reputation. And now, here she was about to be sold into what amounted to slavery. $50. Briggs' voice cut through the crowd like a knife. "I'll take her for 50, and I guarantee you won't recognize her in a year. I'll make a proper servant out of her." The auctioneer raised his gavel. $50 from Mr. Briggs. Going once. Eliza's heart pounded. She'd rather die than spend 5 years under that man's roof. Going twice. $100. The voice came from the back of the crowd, deep and steady as mountain thunder. Every head turned. Through the sea of faces strode a man unlike any Eliza had ever seen. He was tall as a pine tree, with broad shoulders that strained against his worn leather coat. His hair was dark brown and unruly, like he'd been riding hard. But it was his eyes that caught her, gray as storm clouds, and fixed on her with an intensity that made her breath catch. In his arms, he carried a little girl no more than 3 years old. She had golden curls and the biggest blue eyes Eliza had ever seen. The child's tiny hand clutched a ragged doll, and she stared at Eliza with curiosity instead of judgment. The crowd murmured in confusion. Nobody knew what to make of this mountain man who just doubled the highest bid. Briggs scowled and stepped forward. "Now see here, Boone. What's a hermit like you want with a house servant? You barely come to town except for supplies." The man called Boone didn't even look at Briggs. His eyes stayed locked on Eliza's face as he spoke, his voice carrying clearly across the suddenly quiet square. "I don't want her service," he said, and Eliza's heart sank. Then he added words that changed everything. "I want her as my wife." The silence that followed was so complete you could have heard a pin drop in the dirt. Eliza felt her knees go weak. Wife. This stranger wanted to marry her? The little girl in his arms clapped her hands together and giggled, as if this was the most wonderful news in the world. "Wife." The auctioneer's voice cracked. "Sir, this is an auction for indentured service, not marriage contracts." "I know what it is," Boone replied calmly, "but I'm offering her a choice. She can spend 5 years as his property," he nodded toward the red-faced Briggs, "or she could be my wife. Today, right now." The crowd exploded into shocked whispers. Mrs. Henderson from the boarding house gasped so loud it echoed off the buildings. Well, I never, she declared. The very idea. Eliza stared at this mountain man who'd just offered to save her from a fate worse than death. His face was weathered from sun and wind, with lines around his eyes that spoke of both laughter and sorrow. There was gentleness in the way he held his daughter, strength in the set of his shoulders. He wasn't handsome in the way Thomas had been, but there was something solid about him, something trustworthy. "What's your name?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Caleb Boone," he answered. "This is my daughter, Annie. We live up on Bear Mountain, about 3 hours' ride from here. It's quiet, peaceful. You be safe there." Safe. The word hit her like a warm blanket on a cold night. When was the last time she'd felt safe? "And you'd truly marry me? Not just keep me?" Something flickered in his gray eyes. "Pain, maybe. Or loneliness. I'd marry you proper, in front of God and witnesses. You'd be my wife in name and law. What happens beyond that? Well, that would be up to you." Briggs sputtered with rage. "This is ridiculous. I had the winning bid. You can't just change the rules." "Actually," said the auctioneer, mopping his brow with a handkerchief, "if the young lady chooses marriage over service, that's her right. She's not a slave. She has a choice." All eyes turned to Eliza. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she looked between Briggs' cruel sneer and Caleb Boone's steady gaze. 5 years of certain misery, or marriage to a stranger who just offered her freedom. The little girl, Annie, reached out her chubby hand toward Eliza and smiled. "I choose marriage," Eliza said, her voice growing stronger with each word. "I choose Caleb Boone." The crowd erupted into chaos, but Eliza barely heard it. She was looking into the eyes of the man who just saved her life, wondering what on earth came next. The chaos in the town square took nearly an hour to settle. Eliza stood beside Caleb Boone's wagon, still unable to believe what had just happened. One moment, she was about to become Samuel Briggs' property, and the next, she was promised to marry a complete stranger. The townspeople gathered in clusters, whispering and pointing like she was some kind of circus act. "Well, I never seen such a spectacle in all my days," declared Mrs. Prudence Henderson, her voice loud enough for half the square to hear. She adjusted her fancy hat and looked down her nose at Eliza like she was something unpleasant on her shoe. "Buying a wife like she's a sack of flour. It's disgraceful, absolutely disgraceful." "Ain't natural, that's what it ain't," agreed Mrs. Cooper from the general store. "A proper woman don't get herself sold in the first place. There's something wrong with her, mark my words." Eliza felt her cheeks burn with shame, but before she could respond, little Annie tugged on her skirt. "Why are those ladies being mean to you?" the child asked in her sweet, innocent voice. "Daddy says we should be nice to people." Caleb lifted his daughter into his arms and gave the gossiping women a look that could freeze water in July. "Come on," he said quietly to Eliza. "Time we got going." Samuel Briggs wasn't ready to give up so easily. He stomped over to where they stood, his face red as a tomato. "This is all wrong, Boone. I had the winning bid fair and square. You can't just waltz in here and steal what's rightfully mine." "She's not property to be owned," Caleb replied, his voice calm but with steel underneath. "She made her choice. You best accept it." "Choice?" Briggs laughed bitterly. "What kind of choice is that? Marriage to a hermit who lives in the middle of nowhere. She'll be begging to come back to town within a month. Mark my words." Caleb helped Eliza up onto the wagon seat, his hand strong and steady under her elbow. "That would be her decision to make," he said simply. Then he climbed up beside her, settled Annie on his lap, and clicked his tongue at the horses. "We're done here." As the wagon rolled away from the town square, Eliza could feel every eye watching them go. She kept her back straight and her chin up, but inside she was trembling like a leaf in a storm. What had she gotten herself into? She knew nothing about this man except his name and the fact that he'd just saved her from a terrible fate. Was she jumping from one kind of prison into another? The silence stretched between them as they left the town behind and headed up into the hills. The only sounds are the creaking of the wagon wheels and Annie's soft humming as she played with her doll. Eliza stole glances at Caleb from the corner of her eye. His hands were large and calloused from hard work, but he held the reins gently. There was something peaceful about the way he sat, like he belonged out here among the trees and mountains. Finally, Annie's curiosity broke the awkward quiet. "Are you really going to be my new mama?" she asked, turning those big blue eyes on Eliza. Eliza's heart squeezed tight. How did you explain such a complicated situation to a 3-year-old? I, the daddy and I are going to be married, so I suppose that means I'll be taking care of you. Good, Annie said with the simple certainty only children possess. I always wanted a mama. Mine went to heaven when I was born. Daddy told me so. She held up her ragged doll. This is Lucy. She doesn't have a mama either. Maybe you could be her mama too. Tears stung Eliza's eyes at the child's innocent trust. "I like that very much," she managed to say. Caleb cleared his throat. "Annie, why don't you tell Miss Eliza about the cabin? She'll want to know about her new home." "Oh, yes." Annie clapped her hands excitedly. "We have a big fireplace that keeps us warm, and Daddy made me my very own bed. And there's a creek right behind the house where the water tastes like snow. And sometimes deer come right up to the yard, and Daddy lets me name them." As Annie chattered on about her mountain home, Eliza felt some of her fear beginning to ease. Whatever else Caleb Boone might be, he was clearly a loving father. That had to count for something. "What about you?" Caleb asked quietly, his voice barely audible over Annie's excited descriptions. "You got family somewhere? Someone who'll be worried about you?" Eliza shook her head. "No one. My parents died of fever 2 years ago. I thought I had someone, a man named Thomas, who promised to marry me. But he ran off with my inheritance instead, left me with nothing but debts." The words tasted bitter in her mouth. "I'm sorry," Caleb said, and something in his voice told her he truly meant it. "That's a hard thing to bear." "What about you?" she asked. Annie mentioned her mother went to heaven. Caleb's jaw tightened slightly. "Margaret died birthing Annie. Been just the two of us ever since." He paused, then added, "I know this arrangement seems sudden, desperate even, but I want you to know you'll be safe with us. I'm not looking for, that is, I won't expect. What I mean is this marriage can be whatever you need it to be." Eliza felt her cheeks warm at his meaning. "I appreciate your honesty, Mr. Boone." "Caleb," he corrected. "We're to be married, after all. Might as well use first names." The wagon crested a hill, and suddenly the most beautiful sight Eliza had ever seen spread out before them. A log cabin sat in a clearing surrounded by tall pines, smoke rising from its chimney. A garden patch showed the first green shoots of spring vegetables, and a small barn stood nearby. It wasn't fancy, but it looked solid and welcoming. "Home," Annie announced proudly. "Do you like it?" Eliza stared at the little cabin that was about to become her whole world. It was so different from the crowded boarding house room she'd been living in, so far from the cruel whispers of town. "It's perfect," she whispered. But as beautiful as it looked, one question burned in her mind. What exactly would happen once they were alone together in that cozy little cabin? What was Caleb Boone really expecting from this strange marriage arrangement? The first week in Caleb's cabin passed like walking through a careful dance where both partners were afraid to step on each other's toes. Eliza had her own small bedroom, barely bigger than a closet but private, while Caleb and Annie shared the larger room. They were polite strangers sharing morning coffee and evening meals, both trying to figure out how to make this impossible arrangement work. But slowly, something beautiful began to happen. Eliza discovered that the cabin had good bones. It just needed a woman's touch. She found wildflowers growing near the creek and brought them inside in mason jars. She swept and scrubbed until the wooden floors gleamed. Most importantly, she filled the little home with the smell of fresh bread, something that had been missing since Margaret died. Daddy looked. Annie squealed on the fourth morning, her face covered in flour as she helped Eliza knead dough on the kitchen table. "I'm making bread just like Mama Eliza." Caleb, who had been splitting wood outside, froze in the doorway. This was the first time Annie had called Eliza Mama, and the word hung in the air like a held breath. Eliza's hands stilled on the dough, her cheeks flushing pink. She looked up at Caleb with uncertain eyes, as if asking permission for this small intimacy. Something shifted in Caleb's expression, a softening around his gray eyes that made Eliza's heart skip. "Looks like you're learning fast, little one," he said quietly, stepping fully into the warm kitchen. "Your Mama Eliza is a fine teacher." The word mama seemed to unlock something in all of them. Annie became more affectionate, climbing into Eliza's lap for stories and insisting on holding her hand during their evening walks. Eliza found herself humming lullabies she remembered from her own childhood, songs that filled the cabin with gentle music. And Caleb began lingering near the kitchen, watching Eliza work with an expression she couldn't quite read. "You don't have to hover," Eliza said one evening as she stirred a pot of stew. She could feel his eyes on her from where he sat, mending a bridle. "I'm not going to burn down your kitchen." "Our kitchen," he corrected automatically, then seemed surprised by his own words. "I mean, this is your home too now." Their eyes met across the small room, and for a moment neither could look away. There was something building between them, something warm and fragile and entirely unexpected. When Eliza accidentally brushed against Caleb's shoulder while reaching for plates, they both felt the spark. When he steadied her elbow as she climbed down from a chair, his touch lingered just a heartbeat too long. But the outside world wouldn't let them forget how their marriage had begun. Every Saturday, Caleb drove into town for supplies, and every Saturday he came back a little quieter, his jaw a little tighter. Finally, Eliza couldn't stand it anymore. "What do they say about us?" she asked one evening after Annie had gone to sleep. They were sitting by the fire, the comfortable quiet broken only by the crackling logs. Caleb was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then he sighed, nothing worth repeating. "Caleb," she turned to face him fully, "I need to know what we're up against." He rubbed his face with both hands, suddenly looking very tired. "Mrs. Henderson thinks you'll rob me blind and run off in the night. The preacher's wife says we're living in sin since we haven't had a proper church wedding. And Samuel Briggs," his jaw clenched, "Briggs is telling anyone who'll listen that you're not really my wife at all. That you're just he uses words I won't repeat in front of you." Eliza felt her stomach drop. "And what do you tell them?" "Nothing. I don't know them explanations about my life." But she could see the weight of it in his shoulders, the way he avoided her eyes. "Maybe I should go back to town," she said quietly. "Find some other arrangement. I never meant to bring shame on your name." "No." The word came out sharper than he'd intended, and Annie stirred in her sleep. Caleb lowered his voice. "You're not going anywhere. This is your home now. Gossip be damned." The next morning brought unexpected trouble. Eliza was hanging laundry when she noticed a rider approaching fast. It was Tom Miller, who ran the general store, and his face was grim. "Morning, Mrs. Boone," he said, tipping his hat respectfully. At least he had the courtesy to use her married name. "I'm afraid I've got some bad news. The town council met last night." Caleb appeared from the barn, sensing trouble. "What's this about, Tom?" Tom shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. "Well, some of the ladies have been concerned about the moral situation up here. Mrs. Henderson and Mrs. Cooper got the council all worked up. They're saying that since you two haven't had a proper church wedding, your marriage isn't legal. They want to send someone up to investigate." "Investigate what?" Caleb's voice was dangerously quiet. "Whether you're really married or just, well, living in sin. If they decide it's the latter, they could force Mrs. Boone back to town. Maybe even arrest you both for improper cohabitation." Eliza felt the blood drain from her face. After everything, they could still take away this small happiness she'd found? "When?" Caleb asked. "Next Sunday. They want you both in church for a proper ceremony, or they'll consider the marriage invalid." Tom looked genuinely sorry. "I'm real sorry about this, Caleb. Some folks just can't mind their own business." After Tom rode away, Caleb and Eliza stood in their yard staring at each other. The threat hung between them like a storm cloud. A proper church wedding meant public vows, legal commitment, a real marriage in every sense. "We could run," Eliza said quietly. "Take Annie and head west. Start over somewhere they don't know us." Caleb was quiet for a long moment, watching Annie chase butterflies in the garden. Then he looked at Eliza with those steady gray eyes. "Is that what you want? To run?" She thought about the warm kitchen, the sound of Annie's laughter, the way Caleb's rare smiles made her heart flutter. She thought about the life they were building here, fragile as it was. "No," she whispered. "I want to fight for this." "Then we'll give them their church wedding," Caleb said, his voice firm with decision. "Let the whole town watch us make it official." But as he spoke, a new worry crept into Eliza's heart. What would happen after they said those vows in front of everyone? What would Caleb expect from her as his real wife? And more frightening still, what was she starting to want from him? The storm was coming, and they were about to find out if what they'd built together could survive the wind. 3 days before they were supposed to appear at the church, Mother Nature decided to remind everyone who was really in charge. Dark clouds rolled down from the mountains like an army of ghosts, and by afternoon the wind was howling around the cabin like a wild thing trying to get inside. What started as a spring shower quickly turned into something much more dangerous. "This is going to be a bad one," Caleb said, securing the last of the shutters over the windows. Lightning cracked across the sky, followed by thunder so loud it shook the dishes in the cupboard. Could last for days. Eliza tried not to let her nervousness show as she bustled around the kitchen, but the thought of being trapped in the small cabin with Caleb for days made her stomach flutter with something that wasn't entirely fear. Over the past weeks, she caught herself watching him more often, the way his hands moved when he worked, the gentle tone he used with Annie, the rare smiles that transformed his whole face. The storm hit just as they finished supper. Rain lashed against the windows like angry fists, and the wind screamed through the trees with a sound that made Annie whimper and press closer to Eliza's side. "Tell me a story, Mama Eliza," Annie whispered, her little fingers clutching at Eliza's skirt. "A happy one." Eliza settled into the rocking chair by the fire with Annie on her lap, acutely aware of Caleb's eyes on them both. "Once upon a time," she began, "there was a little girl who lived in a beautiful castle." As her voice wove through the familiar fairy tale, Caleb found himself studying Eliza's face in the firelight. She was beautiful, yes, but it was more than that. There was a gentleness about her, a natural grace that made everything she touched seem warmer. When had looking at her become the best part of his day? "Did you always want to be a teacher?" Caleb asked later, after Annie had fallen asleep in Eliza's arms and they'd tucked her into bed. "Since I was Annie's age," Eliza said, settling back into her chair. The storm still raged outside, making the cabin feel like the only safe place in the world. "My mother taught me to read when I was 4, and I thought it was pure magic. I want to give that gift to other children." "What happened?" "To your school, I mean." Eliza's face clouded over. "When Thomas left me, well, scandal follows a woman like smoke. The school board said they couldn't have someone of questionable moral character teaching their children, as if being abandoned made me somehow dangerous to young minds." "That's foolish talk," Caleb said quietly. "Any child would be lucky to learn from you." Their eyes met across the small room, and something passed between them, a understanding, a recognition of shared pain. "What about you?" Eliza asked softly. "You love her very much." "Margaret, I mean." Caleb was quiet for so long that Eliza thought she'd overstepped. Then he spoke, his voice rough with old grief. "She was sunshine and laughter all wrapped up in one person. Never met anyone so full of life." He paused, staring into the fire. "When she died, I thought the world had ended. Didn't know how to go on without her. But you did go on. For Annie. Had to. She was all I had left of Margaret." He looked up at Eliza, then something vulnerable in his gray eyes. I never thought, I figured that was it for me, that I'd used up my chance at happiness. And now, Eliza's heart was beating so fast she was sure he could hear it. Before Caleb could answer, a tremendous crack of thunder shook the cabin, followed immediately by Annie's frightened cry from the bedroom. They both rushed to her, finding the little girl sitting up in bed with tears streaming down her cheeks. "The sky is so angry," Annie sobbed, reaching for both of them. "Make it stop." Without thinking, Eliza scooped Annie up while Caleb sat on the edge of the small bed. Somehow, they ended up huddled together, Caleb's arm around Eliza's shoulders, Annie curled between them, all three seeking comfort in the storm. "It's just noise," Caleb murmured, his voice gentle. "The thunder can't hurt you. We're safe here." "Tell me about when I was born," Annie whispered, the way children do when they need reassurance. "Tell me about Mama Margaret." Caleb tensed, but Eliza's presence seemed to give him strength. "Your mama was so excited when she knew you were coming," he began, his voice soft in the darkness. "She used to talk to you all the time, even before you were born. She'd put her hands on her belly and sing you songs." "What songs?" Annie asked sleepily. "Gentle songs. Sweet ones." Caleb's voice caught slightly. "She said she was going to teach you to bake bread and tend flowers and read books about faraway places." Eliza felt tears prick her eyes as she listened to Caleb share these precious memories. She could feel the weight of his loss, but also something else, the way he was starting to heal, to hope again. "And now Mama, Eliza, does those things," Annie said with the simple wisdom of a child. "Mama Margaret sent her to us, didn't she, Daddy?" Caleb's arm tightened around Eliza's shoulders. "Maybe she did, little one. Maybe she did." The storm continued to rage outside, but inside the little bedroom, something profound was happening. As Annie drifted back to sleep between them, Caleb and Eliza found themselves really looking at each other for the first time. Not as strangers thrown together by circumstance, but as two people who had somehow found exactly what they needed in each other. "Eliza," Caleb whispered, his face so close she could feel his breath on her cheek. "Yes. When we say those vows on Sunday, would you mean them? Really mean them?" Her heart stopped. This was the question she'd been afraid to ask herself. In his gray eyes, she saw her own longing reflected back at her. Somewhere between the bread-making and the bedtime stories, between the gentle touches and shared smiles, the impossible had happened. She'd fallen in love with her husband. "Would you?" she whispered back. Instead of answering with words, Caleb lifted his hand to cup her face, his thumb brushing across her cheek with infinite tenderness. They were leaning closer, the space between them shrinking, when another crack of thunder made Annie stir in her sleep. They pulled apart, both breathing hard, the question hanging between them like a promise. But they both knew the answer now. Sunday's wedding wouldn't be for show. It would be the real beginning of something beautiful and true. The storm outside showed no signs of stopping, and neither did the one building in Eliza's heart. Come Sunday, the whole town would be watching. But first, they had to survive the next few days trapped together, pretending they hadn't just discovered they were falling in love. Sunday morning dawned clear and bright, as if the storm had washed the world clean. But Eliza felt anything but clean as she dressed in her best dress, the same faded blue one she'd worn to the auction just 3 weeks ago. Her hands shook as she tried to pin her hair into a respectable bun. Today, the whole town would be watching, judging, waiting to see if their marriage was real or just some shameful arrangement. "You look beautiful," Caleb said from the doorway, his voice soft with something that made her heart skip. He was wearing his only good suit, the black one he'd been married in before, and Eliza tried not to think about what that meant. "I look like exactly what I am," she replied, her voice bitter. "A woman who was sold like cattle and had to accept charity from a stranger." "No." Caleb crossed the room in 2 quick steps, taking her trembling hands in his steady ones. "You look like my wife. The woman who brought life back to this house, who gave my daughter a mother's love, who made me remember what it feels like to hope again. Their eyes met in the small mirror, and for a moment, Eliza almost believed him. Almost believed she could be more than a desperate woman who'd stood on that auction block. The ride to town was tense with unspoken fears. Annie chattered excitedly about seeing everyone at church, but both adults were quiet, lost in their own thoughts. As they approached the white steeple of Cedar Falls Community Church, they could see the crowds gathering. Far more people than usual for Sunday service. "Looks like we're the main entertainment today," Caleb muttered, his jaw tight. Inside the church, every pew was packed. Heads turned as they walked down the aisle, whispers following in their wake like trailing smoke. Mrs. Henderson sat in the front row, her lips pursed in disapproval. Samuel Briggs smirked from his seat near the back, his eyes cold with satisfaction. Even people Eliza had never seen before had come to witness this spectacle. They found seats in the middle section, Annie settling between them. Eliza kept her chin up and her hands folded, but inside she was dying a slow death of humiliation. These people hadn't come to worship. They'd come to watch her marriage be declared invalid, to see her dragged away in shame. Pastor Whitfield, a kind elderly man who'd always treated everyone with respect, began the service with a prayer for understanding and compassion. But his words were lost in the electric tension that filled the sanctuary. Everyone was waiting for the real show to begin. It happened during the children's hymn. Annie, excited to be in church with both her parents for the first time, stood up on the pew to see better. Her sweet voice rang out clear as a bell as she sang, "Jesus loves the little children." But when the song ended and the children were supposed to return to their seats, Annie turned to Eliza with the innocent joy only a child possesses. "Mama," she called out, her voice carrying through the suddenly silent church. "Mama, did you hear me singing? I remembered all the words like you taught me." The word hit the congregation like a lightning bolt. Gasps rippled through the pews. Mrs. Henderson's mouth fell open in shock. Samuel Briggs sat forward with gleeful anticipation. Every eye in the church turned to stare at Eliza, who felt her face burn with mortification. "Did you hear that?" Mrs. Cooper whispered, loudly enough for half the church to hear. "That child called her mama. They're living like a real family up there." "Shameful," hissed Mrs. Henderson. "Absolutely shameful. That woman has no right to mother that poor child." Pastor Whitfield tried to restore order, but the damage was done. The whispers grew louder, more vicious. Eliza felt every cruel word like a physical blow. Beside her, Caleb sat frozen, his face carved from stone. She waited for him to speak up, to defend her, to say something, anything to stop the cruel gossip. But he remained silent as a grave, his silence feeling like abandonment. When the service finally ended, the real torture began. As they tried to leave, they were surrounded by a crowd of townspeople, all eager to voice their opinions about the scandal they'd just witnessed. "It ain't natural," declared Mrs. Cooper. "A woman who gets herself sold don't deserve to be raising decent children." "Mark my words," added Mrs. Henderson, her voice dripping with false sympathy. "That child will grow up thinking such behavior is normal. What kind of example is that setting?" Samuel Briggs pushed through the crowd, his face twisted with malicious pleasure. Well, Boone, looks like your little arrangement is fooling no one. Everyone can see what kind of woman you've brought into your home." "What's that supposed to mean, Briggs?" Caleb's voice was dangerously quiet. "Come now, we're all adults here. A real wife would have been courted proper, married in church with her family present. But this one," he looked at Eliza with contempt. "This one was bought and paid for, just like any other commodity. Makes a man wonder what other services she's providing for her keep." The crowd gasped at his bold insinuation. Eliza felt her knees go weak with shame and horror. How had her life come to this? How had she become the subject of such cruel speculation? "You're out of line, Briggs," Caleb said, but his voice lacked the fire Eliza desperately needed to hear. "Am I? Seems to me the whole town has a right to be concerned about the moral character of those living in our community, especially when there's a child involved. Briggs looked around at the nodding faces. Maybe it's time someone reported this situation to the territorial authorities. Let them decide if this arrangement is legal. The threat hung in the air like poison. Eliza realized with growing horror that they could lose everything: their home, their family, their fragile happiness. All because she'd been desperate enough to accept Caleb's proposal that day in the town square. That night, back at the cabin, Eliza sat at the kitchen table staring at her hands while Caleb put Annie to bed. The child had asked why everyone seemed angry at church, and neither adult had known how to answer. When Caleb finally emerged from the bedroom, Eliza was already packing her few belongings into a worn carpet bag. "What are you doing?" he asked, though the answer was obvious. Why should have done weeks ago? Her voice was steady, but tears ran down her cheeks. "I'm leaving. Tonight. Before I destroy what's left of your reputation and Annie's future." "Eliza, no. We can fight this." She turned to face him, her heart breaking at the pain in his gray eyes. "Fight with what? You heard them today. You saw their faces. I'm nothing but a bought woman to them, and I always will be. Annie deserves better than to grow up ashamed of the woman raising her. Annie loves you. That's what makes it so much worse." Eliza picked up her bag, her whole body trembling with the effort of walking away from the only happiness she'd ever known. She deserves a mother the town can respect, not one who brings scandal wherever she goes. "And what about what I deserve?" Caleb asked quietly. "What about what I want?" Eliza paused at the door, her hand on the latch. This was the moment she'd been waiting for, the moment he'd fight for her, tell her he loved her, refuse to let her go. Instead, she heard only silence stretching between them, like a chasm too wide to cross. "Goodbye, Caleb," she whispered and stepped out into the darkness, leaving behind the only home she'd ever truly known. Caleb woke the next morning to Annie's heartbroken sobs echoing through the empty cabin. She'd searched every room 3 times, calling for Mama Eliza, until her voice was hoarse, refusing to believe that the woman who'd become her whole world had simply vanished in the night. "Where did Mama go?" Annie cried, throwing herself into Caleb's arms. "Why didn't she say goodbye? Did I do something bad?" The pain in his daughter's voice cut through Caleb's heart like a blade. He'd let the most precious thing in their lives walk away because he was too much of a coward to face down a bunch of gossiping fools. What kind of man did that make him? By noon, word had spread through town that Eliza Boone had disappeared. Some said she'd run off with another man. Others claimed she'd stolen Caleb's money and headed for California. Samuel Briggs made sure everyone knew he'd been right all along about her true character. But Caleb knew the truth. She'd left because she loved them too much to stay and watch their lives be destroyed by association with her. She'd sacrificed her own happiness to protect Annie's future, and he'd let her go without a fight. That evening, as he sat staring into the fire while Annie cried herself to sleep, Caleb made a decision that would change everything. He wasn't going to let the woman he loved disappear into the night like she was nothing. Not when she meant everything. The next Sunday, Caleb Boone walked into Cedar Falls Community Church with Annie in his arms and fire in his eyes. The congregation buzzed with excitement. Everyone wanted to see how the mountain man would handle his wife's scandalous departure. Pastor Whitfield was halfway through his sermon about forgiveness when Caleb stood up in the middle of the sanctuary. Every head turned toward him as he set Annie down and stepped into the center aisle. "I've got something to say," Caleb announced, his voice carrying to every corner of the building. "And you're all going to hear it." "Sir, this is highly irregular," Pastor Whitfield protested gently. "So is a town full of Christians treating a good woman like dirt?" Caleb shot back. But that didn't stop anyone from running their mouths last week. Mrs. Henderson huffed indignantly. "Well, I never. The nerve of some people." "You're right, Mrs. Henderson. The nerve of some people." Caleb turned to face the congregation, his gray eyes blazing. The nerve of people who call themselves Christians while tearing down a woman who never hurt anyone. The nerve of people who judge a woman's worth by her circumstances instead of her character. Samuel Briggs stood up from his pew. Now see here, Boone. We all know what kind of woman you brought into our community. A woman who gets herself sold like livestock is a woman who had nowhere else to turn. Caleb's voice boomed through the church. A woman whose fiancé stole her inheritance and left her with nothing. A woman who chose honest work over dishonest ways, even when that work meant humiliation. You want to know what kind of woman Eliza is? She's the kind who turned my house into a home. The kind who loved my daughter like she was her own flesh and blood. The kind who left everything she cared about because she thought it would protect us from your poisoned tongues. The congregation shifted uncomfortably. Some faces showed shame, others stubborn judgment. She was bought and paid for, Mrs. Cooper called out. Everyone knows it. Yes, she was. Caleb's admission shocked everyone in his silence. And you know what I got for my $100? I got the best woman who ever walked God's green earth. I got a mother for my child, a partner for my life, and the other half of my soul. If that makes me a fool, then I'll wear that title with pride. Annie, inspired by her father's courage, climbed up on the pew and added her small voice to his. Mama Eliza reads me stories and teaches me songs and makes the best bread in the whole world. She gives the best hugs too, and she never gets mad when I get flour everywhere. Pastor Whitfield stepped forward, his elderly face gentle with understanding. Caleb, where's your wife now? Gone, Caleb said, his voice breaking slightly. Gone because I was too much of a coward to stand up for her when she needed me most. Gone because I let her think I cared more about your opinions than I did about her heart. And what do you intend to do about it? The pastor asked quietly. Caleb looked around the church one more time, meeting the eyes of everyone who had driven away the woman he loved. I intend to find her and bring her home. And when I do, I'm going to marry her again, right here in this church, in front of all of you. Because Eliza May Hartwell is my wife in every way that matters, and I don't give a damn who has a problem with that. The gasps and murmurs that followed were interrupted by an unexpected voice from the back of the church. You won't have to look very far. Every head turned toward the door, where Eliza stood silhouetted against the morning sunlight. She was wearing the same faded blue dress, carrying the same worn carpet bag, but there was something different about her, a strength in her shoulders, a determination in her step. Mama, Annie shrieked, launching herself from the pew straight into Eliza's arms. I came back to say goodbye properly, Eliza said, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. To Annie and to you, but I heard every word you just said. She looked at Caleb with wonder in her eyes. Every beautiful, foolish, wonderful word. Will you stay? Caleb asked, crossing the aisle to take her free hand while Annie clung to her waist. Will you be my wife for real this time? Not because you have nowhere else to go, but because this is where you want to be. Only if you mean the vows this time, she whispered, echoing their conversation from that night during the storm. Really mean them. Instead of answering with words, Caleb cupped her face in his hands and kissed her right there in front of the entire congregation. It was a kiss that spoke of love hard won, of second chances and new beginnings, of a man who'd finally learned what was truly worth fighting for. When they broke apart, Pastor Whitfield was smiling. Well then, he said, I believe we have a wedding to conduct. And so it was that Caleb Boone and Eliza May Hartwell were married for the second time, surrounded by the same people who had tried to tear them apart. Some of the congregation left in disgust, but many stayed to witness love triumph over judgment. 1 year later, as Eliza rocked their newborn son while Annie helped Caleb tend a thriving garden behind their cabin, she often thought about that terrible day when she'd stood on the auction block feeling like she was worth nothing. Now she knew better. She was worth everything to the people who truly mattered. her husband, her children, and herself. Sometimes the greatest love stories begin with the darkest moments. And sometimes the woman everyone thinks is worth nothing turns out to be worth absolutely everything.